Hello, and welcome to the second entry in the State Iceberg series. Florida is the flattest state in the Union, and is the home of the infamous Florida Man. According to my previous searches, no one has done an iceberg covering the state. A place that has attack squirrels will always provide some interesting content, and this iceberg is a perfect reflection of the state that's produced people like the ubiquitous Florida Man. Good evening, everyone. My name is Boomslang. I will immediately begin this video with the Advanced Floridian tier, as the first three tiers contained relatively well-known locations and historical events. If you'd like to see these entries and offer suggestions to the original poster, leave it on the original post. That link is available in the description. By the way, some information on the more popular sites was difficult to find, as I was inundated with tourist info sites when I looked up some of these entries. Kudos to Florida for being so great at marketing. I hope you enjoy it. It was a lot of fun to make. Advanced Floridian. Wakulla Springs. Wakulla Springs is 14 miles south of Tallahassee, at the crossroads of State Road 61 and State Road 267. Wakulla translates to River of the Crying Bird, or Strange Waters in different native languages. The spring features an extensive cave and tunnel network that can be accessed in the south side of the pool. It flows into the nearby Wakulla River, has warm temperatures year-round, and serves as a refuge for the Florida manatee. Seminole Wars. This refers to a series of conflicts involving Florida in the period following the American Revolution. When the British took interest in the Spanish colony in the early 1800s, they incited the Seminole tribes against the American settlers who were continually moving south into Seminole territory. The constant attacks on these small villages, combined with the fact that many African American slaves were escaping to Florida from Georgian plantations, incited the U.S. to wage war on the Seminoles in a year-long conflict that took place from 1817 to 1818. Andrew Jackson commanded the U.S. Army in a series of climactic engagements and successfully pushed the Seminoles further south. After the continued harassment by the U.S., the Spanish accepted a treaty that put northern Florida under the control of the United States. Later on, a successful uprising took place, and Florida became a state after a brief stint as a republic. We'll discuss that later on in the video. The U.S. immediately ordered the natives out, and the Seminoles either signed the treaty or fled into the Everglades. Later on, another piece of legislation was signed by some of the remaining tribes that told them to give up their lands within 3 years. As the end of that arrangement approached in 1835, the U.S. Army prepared to force those who refused to leave. By the time the Army arrived to force the Native Americans out, the tribes were ready for war. The Seminoles mounted an extensive guerrilla campaign that continued on until their eradication in 1842, causing grief for the American citizens and military. The Third Seminole War began in 1855. It was also waged over land, when settlers had an armed conflict with the tattered remnants of the Seminole. Constant military patrols and cash prizes for those who captured Indians resulted in less than 200 Seminoles being left in the state by 1858. 1,250 golf courses. Florida, unsurprisingly, contains well over 1,250 golf courses open to the fee-paying public. Florida House. This could refer to the House of Representatives, but I chose to include a Florida Man story. In 2020, a Florida man living in the Il Regalo community in Naples spent multiple days turning his $500K home into a garish, multicolor eyesore. The cherry on top of this story is his face in this mugshot photo in the van he had parked in front of his abode. I mean, you gotta make the van match the house. Diana Niad. Diana Niad is a former U.S. long-distance swimmer, journalist, and reporter. She grew up primarily in southern Florida and entered competitive swimming at the age of 10. After graduating Lake Forest College in Illinois, she set multiple new records in women's marathon swimming. In 1974, she established a new benchmark for the female category in the Bay of Naples race, a competition whose course extended for 22 miles. The next year, Niad completed a 28-mile swim around Manhattan Island in New York City, completing it in 7 hours, 57 minutes, crushing the previous record by close to an hour. In 1979, she swam for 102 miles, swimming from North Bimini to Juno Beach in 27 hours, 30 minutes. Rec Bar. The Rec Bar is a nautical-themed restaurant in the Bee Ocean Resort in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. It is known for its famous live performance, mermaid shows. Hialeah. I'm not sure why the author put the entire town of Hialeah on this iceberg. Hialeah, I think I'm saying that right, is a city with an estimated population of 220,000 as of the 2020 census. Some notable attractions in the town include Amelia Earhart Park and the Curtis Mansion. No offense to anyone living here, it was just interesting to stick this in this tier. This is going to be a recurring theme for this video. Manchineel tree. This tree is common to a large portion of South Florida, the Caribbean, Central America, and it extends into parts of the northern South American continent. Christopher Columbus referred to it as the Little Apple of Death when he and the preceding conquistadors arrived in the New World. The fruits of this tree are small, on average between 1 and 2 inches wide, and smell sweet. However, consuming one results in hours of agony, potential death for victims. In fact, every element of the tree is toxic, as contact or digestion of any parts of the tree can result in injury. The sap has been known to burn the skin of beachgoers seeking shelter from the sun, and cars have been known to have their paint burnt off by falling sap. Burning the wood can result in the toxins being released. These fumes will often cause blindness after initial exposure. Its sap was often used to tip the arrows of the Caribbean tribes in their wars against the Spanish explorers. Cracker cowboys. This refers to a particular variant of the Spanish vaquero. Florida cowboys used dogs and cow whips to herd and capture their cattle. After the First Seminole War, many farmers had abandoned their herds. These cattle adapted to the climate and became immensely profitable as they were hardy and resistant to parasites. Cowboys rose to make money off the wildlife. By 1910, this distinctive type of cowboy was commonplace throughout Florida and utilized smaller breeds of horses to pursue cattle in the swamps. Python invasion. Ever since the 1980s, the Everglades have been infested by large, girthy Burmese pythons that have destroyed the native small animal population. Female pythons lay between 50 to 100 eggs per year, and these hunters have no natural predators. It all started in Miami, which was an epicenter for an exotic pet trade when the business experienced a massive boom in the late 80s. After Hurricane Andrew in 1992, a python breeding facility near the Everglades was destroyed, allowing countless snakes to escape into the wild. Irresponsible owners, or those who couldn't maintain their pets, had released their snakes into the wild before, but this marked the turning point for the python population. It's unknown how many are in this part of Florida. Floridians are allowed to hunt the pythons at any point during the year. St. Johns River. This is the longest river in Florida, bordering some 12 counties and stretching for 310 miles. It's also one of around 30 U.S. rivers that flow northward, and parts of the river are the dwelling of healthy communities of rhesus monkeys, thought to have escaped off a movie set in the 1930s. first passenger flight. The first passenger flight, made by a scheduled passenger service, ever happened on January 1st, 1914. The plane took off from St. Petersburg and landed in Tampa, Florida, a distance of 17 miles that took 23 minutes. The craft was a precursor to the later flying boats. The airline only lasted for 4 months, but the impact it had on the world made the first steps towards transcontinental flight possible. Generation food truck. I think this was meant to be a 3 generations food truck. 3 generations food truck is a highly rated gourmet food truck located in St. Petersburg that serves a variety of seafood items. If I used a false ID to buy seafood from their truck, well, actually, an ID from a different person, you could say I was catfishing. No official state nightmare. So there's a site called the 50 State Nightmares. It's a post transcribed from a video made by a comedian on YouTube with the channel name, I'm probably gonna butcher this, Neil Sisirga. It's a parody of official state birds and other official state things often promoted by the US. Florida has no official state nightmare on this list, but here's a couple of weird ones from the site. West Virginia. You try to tell the cops that there's a fire-breathing dragon in the sky, but whenever they look, it's just a nude man. Texas. You're buried alive in the Big Bird costume. Montana. You left the stove on in your apartment 10 years ago. Now you have to travel back through every apartment you've had to get back to that one to turn it off. Skunk ape. The skunk ape is the Florida version of Bigfoot, named for its pungent odor. It's said to dwell deep within the Everglades. There's a relatively large following for the creature, and a handful of people have dedicated their lives to pursuing it. Some people argue that it's a formerly unknown variety of ape, along with the Bigfoot. Republic of Florida. The free and independent state of West Florida was a republic that lasted for a little over a month. It was created when American colonists finally overthrew the corrupt Spanish regime that had refused to accept the petitions for reform of the colonial government. The Republic of Florida stretched to include large parts of the South, extending out towards the Mississippi and Pearl Rivers, which are now parts of Louisiana. Soon after, the U.S. flag flew over the ramparts of Fort St. Carlos, and the U.S. passively took a piece of territory from the Spanish. The flag became one of the ensigns of the South from 1860 to 61 and inspired the song, The Bonnie Blue Flag. East Coast Railway. The FEC, or Florida East Coast Railway, was founded by a man named Henry Flagler, a tycoon who had helped co-found Standard Oil, one of the largest oil companies ever. Flagler entered Florida in 1878 and saw the potential for development in the area. He later returned in force in 1885, building the area up around St. Augustine, and began construction on a grand hotel named the Hotel Ponce de Leon, as well as local schools, churches, and hospitals. He soon purchased the Jacksonville, Halifax, and St. Augustine Railroad and modernized the weirdly constructed tracks. Over time, he extended the railroad down to the East Coast, and in 1894, the system covered an area from Jacksonville to West Palm Beach. After a project that lasted some 7 years, Flagler created the Oversea Railroad, a track that extended for some 128 miles over water to reach the distant destination of Key West. Overall, Flagler helped contribute to the initial development of multiple major cities in Florida. Super Bowl II. The second Super Bowl was held in 1968 at the Orange Bowl in Miami, Florida. The two competing teams were the Oakland Raiders and the Green Bay Packers, and the final score rested at 33-14 in Green Bay's favor. Eileen Wuornos. Heads up, there will be some brutal mispronunciations of this name. The cases surrounding the serial killer began in 1989 and continued into late 1990. In every case, the victims were robbed, shot, and left on the side of the road as their killer took their car, and there were 7 cases in all. The killer, Wuornos, was arrested in early 1991 after confessing that she was responsible and claimed that she acted in self-defense in every encounter. Wuornos had been in trouble with the law before, as she was involved in multiple cases of armed robbery, auto theft, and check forgery. After the confirmation and revelation of these murders, a following began to gather around her as she expressed that the deaths were in self-defense, and some believed her to be a heroic individual. Later on, she was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to death. Wuornos pleaded guilty and admitted that she had killed for profit and not self-defense. Echo 1. Echo 1 was the world's first communication satellite, allowing for the beginning of the age of communication. You don't say. It was launched in 1960 and was used as a reflector. A signal was shot up to the satellite and reflected back to Earth. The first signal sent to the satellite was a message from President Eisenhower. It is with great personal satisfaction to participate in this first experiment in communications. Echo 1 was used as a conduit for TV, radio, and telephone signals for a short period before burning up in orbit in 1968. Overall, this satellite served as the bridge between primeval satellites like Sputnik and modern arrays. Largest gathering of Ninja Turtles. The largest group of Ninja Turtles was in Orlando, Florida, at the Nickelodeon Suites Resort. 1,394 people gathered in 2014, beating the previous record of 836 fans who gathered at the Mall of America. Largest Easter egg hunt. This entry refers to an event in 2007 in which 501,000 eggs were searched for by some 9,753 supervised kids at the Cypress Gardens Adventure Park in Winter Haven. A's. The A's people were a large people group that lived in Florida before Ponce de Leon and the Spanish arrived in 1513. Consisting of hundreds of thousands of residents at its prime, the A's were hunter-gatherers who spent much of their time fishing and collecting a large variety of fruits. Their largest villages laid near a great lagoon, now known as the Indian River. There are a few surviving descriptions of their culture, outside of a journal kept by a shipwrecked man known as Jonathan Dickinson. He cataloged some elements of their society during his stay in 1699. After this point, the native society began to decline due to constant slave raids from settlers, disease, and the distribution of cheap alcohol. By 1760, they were all but gone. John E. Good Detention Facility, not to be confused with Johnny B. Good. This prison was built to handle the logistical problems surrounding detaining the incarcerated before their trials in the Duval County area. Multiple levels hold on average some 1,700 prisoners of different classifications. Seth Offender Shuffle. This comedy sketch was a parody of the Super Bowl Shuffle, in which accused individuals were forced to rap about their previous crimes. Vizcaya. The Vizcaya Museum and Gardens were formerly the home of a wealthy businessman who was named James Deering. The villa was named after either an explorer or a Spanish coastline, depending on the account. Deering began construction of the site in Miami in 1912, and the residence was completed in 1916. The surrounding gardens, in a small village, were later developed in 1923, and Deering enjoyed use of the site up until his death in 1925. It remained off the radar up until 1971. In that year, 3 robbers broke into the home and stole roughly $1.5 million worth of works of art before being brought to justice. the trust in charge of Vizcaya entered an agreement with Miami-Dade administrators, and the place became a museum open to the public in 2017. Legendary Floridian Skyway Bridge. The Sunshine Skyway Bridge really shouldn't be down this low on the iceberg. The current one serves as a major artery between St. Petersburg and Tampa. The bridge is the second to be built on this spot, as the first bridge collapsed in 1980 when a freighter collided with one of the bridge supports during the storm. Part of the road gave way after the initial impact, and 35 people were killed when a series of vehicles fell into the bay. Fort Caroline. The Fort Caroline National Memorial in Jacksonville commemorates the ill-fated French settlers who attempted to colonize Florida. A group of French Huguenot explorers came ashore at this place and made contact with the native tribes in the early 1560s. In 1564, a small encampment was constructed and named in honor of the French Queen. At one point, the leader of the group, a naval officer named Ribault, led 200 sailors and 400 soldiers to attack a Spanish colony 35 miles to the south. While the defenders were gone, the Spanish commander ordered a surprise attack on the fort. The garrison was only around 200 people at the time, so they were quickly overwhelmed by the Spanish forces. 26 defenders managed to escape. Meanwhile, Ribault's attack ended in tragedy due to a storm. The French fleet was wrecked on the coastline to the south of the Spanish at St. Augustine, and the survivors were picked up and then executed by the Spanish. French attempts to colonize Florida ended after these bloody defeats. William Pope Duval. Duval was the first governor of Florida, and he's one of the few men from this period I've seen who doesn't sport massive sideburns or a large hairdo. Well, outside Napoleon, he looks more like a cool uncle than 1800s politician. Duval served as a lawyer and later House Rep in Kentucky before moving away. He was a territorial judge for a section of the Spanish government up until he was reappointed as a civil governor of the state, and served as a senator for 3 years. He was well known for his peaceful relations with the tribes, for establishing Tallahassee as the state capital. He moved to Texas after his sons went to join the Texan Revolution, practiced law for famous Texans like Sam Houston, and passed away in 1854. Adams-Onis Treaty. This entry refers to the 1819 treaty held between the U.S. and Spain, in which the lines between the two powers were drawn and Florida was ceded to the U.S. The U.S. also paid $5 million for the damages caused by the rebelling citizens who overthrew the governor. Armed Occupation Act. This law was passed by Congress in 1842. Any settler who could settle and cultivate 5 acres of land in eastern and southern Florida would be given 160 acres and a year's worth of food from the government. This was intended to provide people who could defend and cultivate the territory taken away from the Seminoles. The Great Fire of Key West. The largest fire in the history of Key West occurred on March 30th, 1886. The fire began in the San Carlos Hall, a popular meeting place for Cuban revolutionary groups who sought to liberate their homeland. The fire spread quickly, and the firefighters arrived on the scene soon after. The large machine for providing high-pressure water was out of town for repairs, so they only had access to hand pumps. As a result, the fire raged for 12 hours, destroying most of the business district, causing 7 deaths and $2 million in property damage. St. Augustine Lighthouse. This beautiful lighthouse is actually the second erected in this location. The original was built in 1824 and had a long career up until its foundation eroded and it collapsed into the sea along with its original owner. He died when the place collapsed and his spirit continues to linger in the rubble where the older house once stood. Another story surrounds the scent of cigars that is often detected by visitors in the evening, despite the no smoking rule in place. A previous lighthouse keeper named Joseph Andrew loved to light up cigars during his shifts. He died in a tragic incident when he fell while painting the lighthouse exterior. There's even more stories surrounding this area, so the lighthouse is one of the more haunted locations you'll find in this corner of the state. Coral Castle. This structure is made out of some 1,100 tons of coral rock and was the result of a passion project created by a first-generation Latvian immigrant named Edward Leedskalinen. Edward had moved from his home country at age 31 in 1919. He arrived in Florida City after experiencing great heartbreak. Before he left, his betrothed fiancée had left him a day before their wedding. I guess that means she wasn't betrothed anymore. Isn't preventing running from a wedding the point of a betrothal? Anyway, he bought a plot of land 10 miles from Florida City in a smaller town named Homestead. He began construction of an idea for a coral castle, constructed it over 28 years. It took him 3 whole years just to move his belongings to the castle. How Edward constructed the castle remains a shrouded mystery. He stood at 5 feet tall and weighed around 100 pounds, but managed to work with 3 million pounds of oolite coral to construct this place without the aid of assistants or machinery. As you might imagine, this has led to a variety of conspiracy theories claiming the castle was built through supernatural means. His own explanation is he had great knowledge of the way leverage could be used. Edward finally finished construction on the coral carvings in the early 1940s and named the place Rockgate Park. He conducted tours of his castle up until his death in November 1951. It's still open to the public and was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1984. Primordial Floridian, Big Mountain City. This is one of the few sites that serve as a memory to the long-gone Belglade culture. This ceremonial site was placed on the edge of the Lake Okeechobee Basin near the Pinewood Flats, and its boundary was flooded for half the year during the time range in which it was constructed and used. Its ducts flooded and left a few tall structures on their own little islands, which archaeologists believe to be for ritual use. It's covered in a series of causeways and berms that were arranged in a formation that most likely had astronomical use as well. The site is thought to date from around 1450 AD, but many scientists think that the site is far older. The Old Jail. This entry is a former small prison that was in operation between 1891 and 1952. The prison was originally designed to look like a hotel at the time, with a cheerful pink exterior. It housed up to 72 prisoners, contained a maximum security area, general population, and women's prison. There's also ghost orbs and occasional disembodied laughter at night in present day. It's currently open to tours from the public. Bellamy Bridge. One of the most famous ghost stories associated with Florida is the story of Bellamy Bridge, an iron bridge that covered the remaining parts of the original bridge from the 1830s that went over this river. The primary ghost story revolves around the spirit of a young woman named Elizabeth Jane Bellamy. In the 1830s, Elizabeth was the young fiancée of a prominent member of early Floridian society named Dr. Samuel C. Bellamy. Dr. Bellamy was deeply in love with his soon-to-be bride, and he built a beautiful mansion in Mariana that was styled with Greco-Roman style columns along its facade. The wedding date was set for May 11th, 1937, and guests began to arrive as early as a whole week before the wedding. While dancing along during their reception, the two newlyweds stepped too close to a brightly burning brazier. Elizabeth's dress caught fire and burst into flames. Before anyone could react, she ran from the house in a panic as the flames engulfed her. She lingered for a few more days before succumbing to her injuries and was buried under a copse of trees next to the bridge. Her husband became alcoholic and eventually committed a suicide. After that point, her ghost appeared to haunt the mansion and the area of the place she was buried, and could be viewed in the swamps nearby. She often continues to walk along the decrepit iron confines of the newer Bellamy Bridge. Rosewood Massacre. This was the complete destruction of an African American neighborhood that happened in 1923, in the midst of an era that had horrible events like the Tulsa Race Riot occur. A 22-year-old woman named Franny Taylor reported to the sheriff of Sumner that she had been assaulted by a black man. Her husband was a foreman of a local mill, and he quickly gathered a mob to avenge this assault. Over 500 Special K members were gathered in a nearby rally, so they quickly joined the other mobs to look for any black person they could find. After a series of violent events that resulted in multiple deaths of innocent bystanders, the mob shot at a home that contained many young kids who were seeking refuge. The following few days saw the destruction of Rosewood and the death of many of its residents. Axe Handle Saturday. This image says a lot about what took place on August 27, 1960. This entry describes a racially motivated riot in which over 200 white rioters and Klansmen attacked the black residents of Jacksonville, Florida, with blunt weapons ranging from baseball bats and axe handles. It was in response to a peaceful lunch counter demonstration in which young protesters were spat on, yelled at, and eventually beaten with the detached wooden handles of axes. The mob spread, and soon people were attacking any black person they saw, while the police stood idle. Victims fled to a nearby church and engaged in song and prayer until the mob dispersed. Perry Race Riot. This incident occurred in 1922, under similar circumstances to the Rosewood Massacre. A popular young schoolteacher named Ruby Hendry was found dead in the northwest corner of Perry, Florida, near the railroad tracks. There were signs of a struggle, and this phase will probably ensure this video is demonetized. Slash marks were found on her neck. Rumors spread around the small town that an African American had committed the crime, and 2 black men were seized in the days after the discovery of Hendry's body. First, a 21-year-old man named Charlie Wright was seized by the mob and executed. His death was soon followed by the murder of another young man named Authors Young at the hand of the same mob. After these 2 deaths, riots erupted, and massive sections of the black community were condemned to mob violence. I'm 95% sure this was a case of a drifter killing the woman, and the community choosing to destroy the people they were afraid of instead of actually investigating the crime. Oviedo Lights. This phenomenon is said to occur on a road that runs near Snow Hill, a remote area closest to the town of Oviedo. High schoolers have flocked to this site since the early 1950s to observe the balls of light that gather during the warmer months. These lights are said to range from 1 to 5 spots of light that often pursue nearby cars. Scientists believe that these lights are due to the decomposition of vegetation in the nearby swamps. Tam-Miami Trail. This does not belong in this tier. The Tam-Miami Trail stretches for over 270 miles to connect Tampa to Miami, as the name implies. Cutler Fossil. The Cutler Fossil Site is a place that contains a menagerie of ancient creatures, both extinct and present today. The site, originally uncovered in 1985, has brought to light the skeletal remains of dire wolves, llamas, an American lion, a giant sloth, and prehistoric horse-like creatures. It's near Miami, but its exact location hasn't been disclosed to the public to protect the excavations. Or maybe that's what they want you to believe. Nuestra Senora de Atocha. This was the world's most valuable shipwreck. This galleon and its sister ship, the Santa Margarita, were hit by a hurricane in 1622. Only 5 men survived out of the Nuestra Senora's 265-man crew. After another subsequent hurricane that destroyed the ship that attempted to recover the gold, the shipwreck's location was lost to time. In 1985, it was rediscovered near the Florida Keys and recovered by a treasure hunter named Mel Fisher. Its contents were valued at some $400 million. Some of the artifacts currently remain in the Mel Fisher Maritime Museum in Key West. Pinecraft Community. I've passed by here multiple times in my visits to Florida. Pinecraft is a small neighborhood that houses Amish and Mennonite individuals who come here to live or escape the weather of the colder northern East Coast states. They also have a Yoder's, which has some really great pie. True Floridian. Devil's School. The ruins of the Annie Lytle Elementary School serve as a graffiti-covered location inhabited by squatters and visited by groups of teenagers throughout the past few years. The school began operations in 1918 before it was choked out by the construction of a junction connecting I-10 and I-95 that was built next to the school. It was decommissioned in 1960 and was used as a storage space by the county up until it was condemned in 1971. It immediately captured the interest of local kids, and the myths surrounding this elementary school began to increase dramatically. The story says that the last janitor of the school often kidnapped students, took them out in the boiler room beneath the building, took them out, and destroyed the remains in the boiler. It was said that a child managed to survive and caused an explosion in the boiler, sending the place up in flames. This story may sound familiar if you've seen A Nightmare on Elm Street, as it might have inspired some of the plot points from that slasher film. This site has served as the location for multiple police cases involving people who were found or suspected to be participating in cult activities. It was declared a historic landmark in 2000, saving it from being destroyed and replaced by condos. Volunteers have tried to keep the place clean in the past in hopes it will be used again someday. Despite these hopes, the site has continued to lie stagnant into the present day. Devil's Chair. For those of you who remember the story of Black Aggie in the Maryland video, this will sound familiar. Devil's chairs, or haunted chairs, were architectural designs that were often placed in cemeteries in the US in the Victorian era. Cemeteries from this period were often laid out like parks, and these chairs were placed for the comfort of those attending the grave sites of the deceased. They were primarily laid out as monuments, but these chairs soon earned a few superstitions and legends amongst people growing up near these places. Anyway, the Florida Devil's Chair is located in the so-called psychic center of the world, the small town of Cassadaga, Florida, located 35 miles north of Orlando. The architecture of this little town remains mostly unchanged since the construction of many buildings in the late 1800s, and it has a place on the National Historic Register. The Cassadaga Cemetery contains a red brick mourning chair known as the Devil's Chair. It's said that if you sit on it late at night, the devil will appear beside the brick edifice and speak to you. Overall, I wasn't that convinced, but the US Ghost Adventure site that gives options to tour it is pretty funny. Here's a quote from the site. The best known legend of the Devil's Chair is that if one leaves a can of unopened beer on the bench, one can find it empty the next morning, but unopened. The haunted school's alright, but putting a beer near this chair and returning to see the beer unopened but empty is downright horrifying. This site is like, support your spooky local businesses. Friedan disappearance. The Friedan was a small tramp freighter who went missing along with its 9-person crew, en route to Haiti from Miami in 1989. The crew was composed of 7 Haitians, a young captain, an American journalism student named Lisa Bishop. Lisa had intended to compose an article contrasting the wealth of America in comparison to the devastated island of Haiti. At the moment, the case remains unsolved, but investigators remain convinced that the young captain of the vessel, a man named Florian Burke, is the key to the entire case. Lime Street. This entry is referring to the devastating Lime Street fire that occurred on the 16th of October in 1990. Officers arrived to find the 35-year-old man who owned the residence, named Gerald Wayne Lewis, standing in the front yard with his son, Jeremiah. His wife, sister-in-law, and the sister-in-law's children were unable to get out of the residence and died in the house fire. Police immediately launched an investigation to Lewis, most likely because he had 3 surnames, and it seemed he had just sat idly by while his family had remained inside. A local prosecutor investigated the case, determined that previous investigations into the cause of the fire were flawed. The prosecutor, named John Latini, ordered another house constructed of the same materials and with an identical layout to be built. After furnishing it identically with the owner's previous home, they set fire to the couch in the faux house's living room. Surprisingly, the room went up in flames in less than 4 minutes instead of the expected 15. This meant that Lewis had not enough time to rescue all of his family. He had not intentionally set the fire. He had in fact been unable to rescue them in time. As a result, investigations into arson have improved and allowed for less opportunities for an innocent person to be punished. Zachary Bernhardt. Zach Bernhardt was last seen on September 11, 2000, in Clearwater, Florida. His mother, Leah, left him that night at 2 a.m. in the morning as she was suffering from insomnia. After leaving for a period variously described as short as 15 minutes or as long as 2 hours, she returned home to find her son gone. Authorities believe that Leah had a connection to her son's disappearance, as she quickly moved out of state and changed her name. The most likely suspect is a local man named Kevin Jaybert, convicted of being obsessed with young boys in ways that I can't name in this video. If you want to know, check out the original case, but I am not going to go in depth on that right now. Despite the allegations, Jaybert has continued to refute the accusation leveled against him, and the case remains in stasis to this day. Fort Myers skeletal remains. In 2007, a land surveyor stumbled upon a human skull in the woods near Arcadia Street in Fort Myers. Forensic technicians were dispatched to the scene, and excavation began shortly after the initial discovery. 8 bodies were found, and many of the skeletons were of males between the ages of 20 years old and 40 years old. They featured healed fractures on their arms, legs, and faces, evidence that suggested that these men had had their faces and other body parts damaged multiple times and broken. 3 of the men were later identified: one Eric Kohler, age 21, from Port Charlotte; John Blevins, age 26, from Fort Myers; and Jonathan Tahay, age 24, also of Fort Myers. All these men were reported missing in 1995. Doomsday Tower. This structure, often called the Mount Dora Catacombs, is a 5,000 square foot network of chambers and deep tunnels. Located 6 feet under an orange grove near the small town of Mount Dora, the bomb shelter had a 2,000-pound steel door that was unable to be opened from the inside. The inhabitants were expected to dig their way out of the shelter with the use of the shovels in the bunker. Partially finished tunnels leading to the surface were easily accessible. A small seed vault was available for when the survivors emerged from the bunker to sow seeds on the surface after the global nuclear catastrophe. The shelter was well equipped, and included an armory, residential areas, and a morgue among many other facilities. It was designed to hold around 100 people from the wealthy families that lived in the area. Alright, that's it for tonight. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed the video, check out some of the other ones I've made in the past. I'll be covering more icebergs in the near future. Thank you so much for watching this far. I thought this iceberg was alright, but I think we need a Florida Man iceberg. If you make it, and it's well done, I will cover it. Take care, and good night.